I've never really talked about this before. Not to anyone, not even to a therapist. Mostly because it sounds insane, but also because it's just too disturbing. But lately it's been getting worse, so I figured maybe writing it out would help. Or maybe someone out there has experienced something similar and can tell me what the hell is going on. God, I hope someone can help me. This started when I was a kid. I must have been around 7 or 8 years old. My family had just moved into this old, creaky house in a small, quiet town. The kind of place where nothing exciting ever happens, or so I thought. It was the kind of house where the floors groaned when you walked on them, and the windows never really shut properly. I remember being scared of it from the moment we stepped inside, but my parents were thrilled. They loved the character of the place, whatever the hell that means. The first time I saw him was about a week after we moved in. My room was on the second floor, facing the backyard. We had this massive tree right outside my window. The branches were so thick that they blocked out most of the sunlight during the day. At night, though, it was like they came alive. The shadows they cast were terrifying, like twisted hands reaching out to grab you. I had to sleep with a nightlight because of it. One night, I woke up for no reason at all. You know that feeling when something wakes you up, but you're not sure what? Like your brain is trying to tell you something's wrong, but you can't figure out what it is? That's exactly what happened. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out why I was awake when I heard it. A soft tap, tap, tap on the glass. It was so faint that at first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. I remember pulling the covers up to my chin, heart pounding in my chest. I was terrified, but also curious. What kid isn't curious about something weird happening at night? I slowly turned my head towards the window, and that's when I saw him. A man standing outside my window, staring at me. Just standing there, completely still, with his face pressed up against the glass. Even now, years later, I can still see his face. He was pale, almost ghostly, with deep-set eyes that seemed to sink into his skull. His skin was stretched tight, like it barely fit over his bones. His mouth was twisted into this horrible grin, like he knew something I didn't. And his eyes, they were dead. I don't mean they looked dead. I mean they were literally dead. There was no life in them, no emotion, nothing. Just empty, hollow sockets staring right at me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen, paralyzed with fear. All I could do was stare back at him. We must have stayed like that for what felt like hours, just staring at each other. I don't even remember blinking. Eventually, though, I worked up the courage to close my eyes, hoping that when I opened them again, he'd be gone, but he wasn't. He was still there, still staring at me with that twisted grin on his face. I don't know how long I lay there, trying to pretend I was asleep, but eventually, I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion. When I woke up the next morning, the man was gone, and for a brief moment, I thought I had imagined the whole thing. But then I saw the smudges on the window, right where his face had been. The glass was fogged up, like someone had been breathing on it all night long. I tried to tell my parents, but they just brushed it off as a bad dream. I was a kid after all, and kids have nightmares, right? But I knew it wasn't a dream. I knew what I saw was real, and that was just the beginning. The man kept coming back. Night after night, he would appear at my window, always staring, always grinning. Sometimes he would tap on the glass, trying to get my attention. Other times, he would just stand there in silence, watching me. I tried everything to make him go away. I stopped looking at the window, started sleeping with the light on, even pushed my bed to the other side of the room. But no matter what I did, he was always there. It got to the point where I was too scared to sleep. I would lie awake for hours, just waiting for him to show up. I started hearing things too. Whispers in the dark, footsteps outside my door, soft creaking noises like someone was walking around my room. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, sure that he was inside the house, watching me from the shadows. And then, one night, he wasn't outside my window anymore. He was inside my room. I woke up to the feeling of someone breathing on me, hot and rancid. My eyes snapped open, and there he was, standing right beside my bed, leaning over me. I could feel his breath on my face, feel the cold, clammy touch of his fingers on my arm. His eyes were inches from mine, and I could see something in them now. hunger. A deep, primal hunger that made my stomach turn. I tried to scream, but he clamped a hand over my mouth, his fingers digging into my skin so hard I thought they would break. He leaned in closer, his breath burning against my cheek, and whispered something in my ear. I don't know what he said. His voice was low, guttural, like it was coming from the depths of hell itself. But whatever it was, it made my blood run cold. And then he was gone, just like that. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, like he had never been there at all. I didn't sleep for days after that. I was too scared to close my eyes, too scared that if I did, he would come back. But eventually I couldn't stay awake any longer. My body just gave out, and I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke up, everything seemed normal again. The man didn't come back, not for a long time. I started to think maybe it really had been just a nightmare. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew he was still out there, watching, waiting. And then, years later, he came back. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just me he was after. Years passed after that first incident, and for a while I thought I had left it all behind. My parents eventually sold the old house, and we moved to a different town when I was around 12. It was supposed to be a fresh start. New school, new friends, new everything. But no matter how much I tried to forget, the memory of that man, that thing, was always lurking in the back of my mind. I'd see shadows in the corner of my eye, hear faint tapping on the windows at night, but I'd always brush it off as my imagination. After all, I was a kid back then. Kids have overactive imaginations, right? High school came and went, and by the time I hit college, I was pretty convinced it was all just some fucked up childhood nightmare. I even started joking about it with my friends when we'd share ghost stories after a few too many drinks. It was always easier to laugh about it when I was surrounded by people, when it seemed like the kind of thing that only happens in movies. But then, during my sophomore year, I moved into an apartment off campus with a couple of roommates, and that's when the weird shit started happening again. It began small, like before, just little things that were easy to dismiss. Objects would go missing and turn up in strange places. I'd hear footsteps in the hall when I was home alone. Lights would flicker, even though the wiring was fine. But what really set me on edge was the feeling of being watched. I would sit in the living room trying to study, but I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was standing just out of sight, staring at me. It was the same feeling I had all those years ago, lying in bed, trying to ignore the man outside my window. One night, after my roommates had gone out for the evening, I decided to take a shower and try to shake off the paranoia. The water was scalding hot, and the steam filled the bathroom, fogging up the mirror. I was starting to relax, letting the heat work the tension out of my muscles, when I noticed something strange. There, on the fogged-up mirror, were words. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the steam, but as I wiped away the condensation, I saw them clearly. "I'm still here." My heart dropped into my stomach. I stared at the words, not even caring that the water was starting to turn cold. I hadn't written that. No one else had been in the apartment all day. I quickly turned off the shower, threw on my clothes, and practically ran out of the bathroom. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely unlock my phone to call my roommates. I needed someone to come back, anyone, just so I wasn't alone. But none of them answered. It was just me in that apartment, with those words on the mirror and that feeling of being watched pressing down on me like a weight. That's when I heard the first scream. It was coming from outside, a woman's scream, high-pitched and terrified. My first thought was that someone was being attacked, so I ran to the window, peeking through the blinds to see what was going on. But the street outside was empty. No one was there, and the scream had stopped as suddenly as it started. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting for something else to happen, but the night was silent, eerily silent. Then, just as I was about to turn away from the window, I saw him, the man, standing on the sidewalk, directly under the street lamp, staring up at my window. It was like he had never aged, like time hadn't touched him at all. He looked exactly the same as he had when I was a kid, pale, hollow-eyed, that same twisted grin plastered on his face. Only this time, there was something different about him, something worse. His mouth was open, wide, too wide, like his jaw had unhinged, and I could see darkness inside. a bottomless, yawning void that seemed to suck in the light around him. He started walking towards the apartment building, slowly, deliberately, never taking his eyes off me. My blood ran cold, and I stumbled back from the window, tripping over the coffee table and landing hard on the floor. I scrambled to my feet and locked the front door, then the windows, then every other door in the apartment. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I call the police? What would I even tell them? That a man who's been haunting me since I was a kid was outside my apartment? They'd think I was insane. I grabbed a kitchen knife and sat in the corner of the living room, back against the wall, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Every little noise made me jump. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sounds of traffic outside. But then, over all of that, I heard it again. The tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window in the living room this time. Slowly, almost mechanically, I turned my head to look, even though I knew I shouldn't. I couldn't help it. It was like I was being drawn to it. And there he was, pressed up against the glass, just like before, his dead eyes locked onto mine. But this time, he was closer. His face was right up against the window, his hands pressed flat against the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. And then he spoke. "I've been waiting," he whispered, his voice low and raspy, like sandpaper against my ears. "I'm so hungry. So hungry." My stomach churned, and bile rose in my throat. There was something wrong with his voice, something not human. It was like he was speaking through a mouthful of broken glass, each word cutting deeper into my brain. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, just like when I was a kid, trapped in that same horrible, helpless terror. Then, out of nowhere, the screaming started again. But this time, it wasn't outside. It was inside the apartment, echoing through the halls, bouncing off the walls. It was deafening, like someone was being tortured right there in the next room. I dropped the knife and covered my ears, but it didn't help. The screaming was everywhere, filling my head, drowning out everything else. I don't remember much after that. I think I blacked out. When I came to, it was morning and the apartment was quiet. My roommates were back, acting like nothing had happened. They were making breakfast, talking about their night out, oblivious to the fact that I had spent the night in a waking nightmare. I tried to ask them if they had heard anything, seen anything, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. I checked the window, but there was no sign of the man. No smudges, no breath marks, nothing. It was like he had never been there, but I knew what I saw. I knew he was real, and I knew he was coming back. I tried to go back to normal after that night, but there was no normal to go back to. I was a mess. Every little noise set me on edge. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything other than the man. He was all I saw when I closed my eyes. The image of his hollow, grinning face was burned into my brain. My roommates noticed, of course. They kept asking if I was okay, but what could I tell them? That I was being haunted by a man who shouldn't exist. That I was afraid he was going to break into our apartment and do God knows what to me. I started avoiding them, locking myself in my room whenever they were around. I didn't want them to think I was crazy, but I was starting to feel like I was. Then came the night I couldn't escape. I was alone in the apartment again. My roommates had gone out for the weekend, leaving me by myself. I thought about going with them, getting the hell away from the place, but I was too scared to leave. It didn't make sense, I knew that. But I felt like if I left, he'd follow me, like there was no escaping him, no matter where I went. So I stayed, telling myself I was being paranoid, that I'd just stay up all night watching movies or something and everything would be fine. But everything wasn't fine. It started with the smell, a rancid, rotting stench that filled the entire apartment, so thick I could taste it in the back of my throat. It was like something had died in the walls. I tore the place apart, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. No dead animal, no garbage, nothing. The smell was just there, hanging in the air like a thick, oily fog, and then the lights started flickering. At first, it was just the living room light, dimming and brightening like it was struggling to stay on. Then the hallway light went out completely. I grabbed a flashlight and started moving through the apartment, checking the fuse box, but everything was fine. There was no reason for the lights to be acting up, but they were. That's when I heard it. That horrible, wet, sucking sound. like something was crawling through the walls, dragging itself closer and closer. I froze, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it was right on top of me, pressing down on me from all sides. I spun around, shining the light into every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing there. Just that sound. That horrible, wet, squelching sound, as if something was trying to force its way into the apartment, into me. I backed into the living room, heart racing, sweat pouring down my face. The smell was unbearable now, thick and cloying, making my stomach turn. I was trying to figure out what to do, where to go, when I heard a voice. His voice. "Come to me." It was a whisper, barely audible, but I heard it clear as day. My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from outside, or from the walls. It was coming from inside my head, echoing through my skull, bouncing around in my brain like a trapped fly. I dropped the flashlight, clutching my head, trying to drown out the voice, but it kept getting louder, more insistent. "Come to me!" I started backing away, tripping over the coffee table, nearly falling over. I was in full panic mode, my mind screaming at me to get out, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. It was like I was stuck in place, my feet glued to the floor. And then I saw him. He was standing in the hallway, half shrouded in shadow, his dead eyes locked onto mine. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, in the darkness, I could see shapes. Twisted, malformed figures, crawling on all fours, dragging themselves towards me. Their bodies were bloated and swollen, their skin stretched thin over bulging, pulsing masses of flesh. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like marionettes with their strings tangled, their mouths opening and closing as if they were trying to speak. But all that came out was that horrible, wet, sucking sound. "Come to me!" The man stepped closer, his grin widening, his eyes burning into mine. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, could hear the whispers growing louder, more urgent. I stumbled back, trying to get away, but the apartment was warping around me, the walls closing in, the floor twisting under my feet. The air was thick, suffocating, filled with that rancid stench and the sound of something crawling, something slithering just out of sight. I turned and ran, bolting for the front door, but the hallway stretched out in front of me, growing longer and longer with every step I took. The whispers were inside my head, filling my mind with thoughts that weren't mine, urging me to give in, to let him in. I could feel something cold and slimy brushing against my skin, could hear the floor creaking under the weight of something massive, something that was coming for me. I reached the front door, hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. The moment the door swung open, I threw myself out into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't stop to think. I just ran. I didn't care where I was going, didn't care who saw me, I just needed to get away. I ended up at a 24-hour diner, shaking so badly that I couldn't even hold the cup of coffee the waitress brought me. My phone was dead, so I couldn't call anyone. I just sat there, staring out the window, waiting for the man to appear, for those twisted, bloated figures to drag themselves through the door. But they never did. The diner was bright, warm, and filled with the smell of frying bacon and coffee. It was the exact opposite of the nightmare I had just fled from, but it didn't make me feel safe. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again. I stayed at that diner until the sun came up, until the light of day drove away the shadows that had been chasing me. When I finally worked up the courage to go back to the apartment, I half expected to find the door wide open, the place ransacked, but everything was exactly as I had left it. The front door was locked, the lights were on, and the air was clear. There was no sign of the man, no sign of the things that had been crawling through the walls, but I knew better. I knew he was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next time I was alone. And I knew, deep down, that no matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, I could never escape him. I wish I could say that after that night, I finally decided to get help. That I moved out, got a new place, saw a therapist, or did something sane. But the truth is, I didn't. I stayed. Maybe it was the fear that if I left, it would somehow get worse. Or maybe it was the stubborn belief that I could figure it out on my own. I don't know. But whatever the reason, I stayed in that apartment, even though I knew something was horribly, terribly wrong. For weeks, nothing happened. The lights stopped flickering, the smell disappeared, and the apartment seemed almost normal. But I wasn't fooled. I knew he was still there, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. Every night I stayed up, staring at the door, waiting for it to open, waiting for him to come for me. But he didn't. Not for a while anyway. One night, I finally decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. I couldn't keep living in fear, waiting for the man to show up and drive me insane. So I decided to fight back. I started researching everything I could about hauntings, demons, whatever this thing could be. I scoured the internet, reading forums, watching videos, anything that might give me a clue about how to get rid of him. I bought sage, holy water, salt, anything that was supposed to protect against evil spirits. It sounds stupid now, looking back, but at the time, I was desperate. I had to believe that there was something I could do, some way to take control of my life again. So, one night, I decided to put it all to the test. I waited until my roommates were gone, then locked myself in the apartment and started the ritual. I began by burning the sage, walking from room to room, waving the smoke into every corner, every crevice. I could feel the air growing thick around me, the smell of the sage mixing with something foul, something rotten. But I kept going, muttering the words I had read online, trying to banish whatever was haunting me. I sprinkled salt along the windowsills, across the doorways, creating a barrier that was supposed to keep him out. I dipped my fingers in the holy water and flicked it across the walls, praying under my breath, even though I wasn't religious. For a moment, I thought it might actually be working. The air felt lighter, the apartment seemed brighter, and the oppressive feeling that had been hanging over me for so long started to lift. But then, I heard it. The sound that had haunted me for years. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the living room window, soft but insistent. My heart stopped. I knew what I'd see before I even turned around, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned, my eyes landing on the window, and there he was, just as I knew he'd be, staring at me with that same dead grin, his eyes empty, hollow. Only this time, there was something different. The shapes behind him, those twisted, bloated figures, were clearer now. I could see their faces, their hands pressed against the glass, their mouths opening and closing as if they were trying to speak. I felt the cold wash over me, the air growing thick and heavy. The sage smoke swirled around them, but it did nothing to drive them away. The salt on the windowsill seemed to fade, dissolve into nothing as the man pressed his face closer to the glass. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt that same paralyzing fear grip me. But this time, I fought against it. I grabbed the vial of holy water and splashed it at the window, screaming at him to leave, to get out of my life. For a second, everything went silent. The tapping stopped. The figures behind him seemed to blur, fade into the darkness. I thought, maybe, just maybe, it had worked. But then, without warning, the window shattered. Not inwards, like something was trying to get in, but outwards, as if the man had just forced himself through the glass and into the apartment. The cold hit me like a physical force, knocking me to the ground. I scrambled back, my hands slipping on the broken glass, cutting into my skin. The air was filled with that horrible, rancid smell, so strong that I gagged, my eyes watering. I could see him now, standing in the middle of the room, the shadows twisting around him, his grin wider than ever. He didn't say anything this time. He just stared at me, his eyes burning into mine, and then he started to move. Slowly, deliberately. He stepped over the broken glass, the twisted figures crawling in behind him. They were inside now, their bloated bodies dragging across the floor, their mouths opening and closing, that horrible sucking sound filling the room. I tried to get up, tried to run, but I couldn't move. It was like the air had turned to lead, pressing down on me, crushing me. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. My vision started to blur, the edges of the room growing dark, but I could still see him, still see that grin as he reached out towards me. I thought I was going to die. I could feel my heart slowing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But then, just as his hand was about to touch me, something changed. The air around us seemed to crackle, like static electricity, and the figures behind him started to writhe, their bodies twisting and contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The man's grin faltered just for a second, and I felt the pressure on my chest lift. I gasped for breath, my vision clearing just enough to see what was happening. The figures were melting, their flesh dripping off their bones, pooling on the floor. The man turned, his eyes narrowing, and for the first time, I saw something in them. Fear. He looked back at me, his mouth opening as if he was going to speak. But before he could, the shadows around him erupted. They swarmed over him, twisting and writhing, pulling him apart piece by piece. I could hear him screaming, a sound so high-pitched and unnatural that it made my ears bleed. The shadows consumed him, pulling him into the darkness until there was nothing left but the sound of his screams echoing in the empty room. And then, just like that, it was over. The apartment was silent, the air clear. The man was gone, and so were the figures that had followed him. I was alone, lying on the floor, covered in cuts and bruises, but alive. I don't know how long I lay there, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I managed to get up, my body aching with every movement. The apartment was a wreck, broken glass everywhere, the walls covered in strange, dark stains that I couldn't identify. But it was over. He was gone. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. He might have been gone for now, but I could still feel him lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. I knew that no matter what I did, no matter where I went, he would always find me. Because this wasn't just a haunting. It was something much worse. And it wasn't over yet. I tried to pretend that it was over, that the man and those things he brought with him were gone for good. But the truth is, I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. I felt like I was living on borrowed time, like each day that passed without incident was just a cruel joke, a brief respite before the real terror began again. I started avoiding the apartment as much as possible, spending nights at friends' places, crashing on couches, anywhere but there. But I couldn't avoid it forever. Eventually, I had to go back. When I did, it was like stepping into a tomb. The apartment was cold, unnaturally so, even though the heat was on full blast. The air was heavy, stale, like it hadn't been breathed in for years. Every sound echoed in the silence, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of fabric. It was like the place had been waiting for me, biding its time, gathering strength. The first few nights were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was worse than ever before. I could feel eyes on me everywhere I went, feel the pressure of a gaze that never wavered, never blinked. I barely slept, and when I did, it was in short, fitful bursts, always with one ear open, waiting for the inevitable. And then it happened. It was a Friday night, and my roommates were out of town again. I had nowhere else to go, no excuses left to avoid being alone. I tried to distract myself, watching TV, playing video games, anything to keep my mind off the creeping dread that had settled in my gut. But it was no use. No matter what I did, I could feel him getting closer, feel the darkness gathering around me like a storm. The lights started flickering around midnight, the same way they had before. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just faulty wiring, but I knew better. I knew what was coming. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting until I could see my breath. And then, the smell returned. That rancid, rotting stench that filled the apartment, thicker than ever before. It was like the walls were oozing decay, like the entire building was rotting from the inside out. I grabbed the kitchen knife again, though deep down, I knew it was useless. I don't know why I even bothered. Maybe it was the last shred of hope, the last bit of sanity I was clinging to. I moved through the apartment, checking every room, every corner, but it was empty. Or at least, it looked empty. But I could feel them, feel him, just out of sight, just beyond the edge of the light. I ended up in the living room, standing in the middle of the floor, my back to the wall, trying to watch every shadow at once. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped the knife. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides, suffocating me. I could feel it building, that same pressure, that same sense of something huge and terrible pushing its way into the world. And then, the lights went out. I was plunged into darkness, complete and utter. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and panicked, echoing in the silence. The smell was overpowering now, choking me, making my eyes water. I fumbled for my phone, for the flashlight, But before I could turn it on, I heard the sound. That familiar, sickening tap, tap, tap. But it wasn't coming from the window this time. It was coming from inside the apartment. I swung the knife wildly, slashing at the air, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness, pressing in on me, suffocating me. The tapping grew louder, closer, until it was right beside me, just inches from my face. I could feel the cold breath on my neck, could hear the wet, rasping sound of his voice as he whispered in my ear. "I'm here." The panic hit me like a freight train. I turned and ran, bolting for the door, but the apartment had changed. The walls seemed to twist and shift around me, the hallway stretching out like it had before. The door was farther away with every step I took, the darkness closing in, swallowing me whole. I could hear him behind me, hear the tapping, the whispers, the slithering sound of those things crawling closer, reaching for me. I don't know how I made it to the door, but somehow I did. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I yanked the door open, ready to throw myself out into the hallway, but what I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. The man was there, standing in the doorway, his grin wider than ever, his eyes empty pits of darkness. Behind him, the hallway was gone, replaced by a void, a swirling mass of shadows and writhing figures, their faces twisted in agony, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. The air was thick with the stench of decay, with the sound of wet sucking noises as the figures crawled over each other, dragging themselves closer. He stepped forward, one slow, deliberate step, and I felt the cold wash over me, freezing me to the core. I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The apartment had closed in around me, the walls pressing down, trapping me. I could feel the shadows reaching for me, could hear the whispers in my mind, urging me to give in, to let them take me. "I've waited so long," the man whispered, his voice a rasping hiss. "So long." He reached out, his hand cold and clammy, like the touch of death itself. I could feel it closing around my throat, feel the life being drained out of me. The room spun, the darkness closing in, and I knew this was it. There was no escape, no fighting back, no last-minute rescue. This was how it ended. But just as the darkness was about to swallow me whole, something changed. The shadows around me seemed to recoil, the man's grip loosening just enough for me to gasp for air. The whispers in my head faded, replaced by a new sound, a voice, soft but clear, cutting through the darkness. "Don't give in." I don't know where it came from, or who it belonged to, but it was enough. It gave me the strength to fight back, to push against the man's grip, to force my way through the suffocating cold. I grabbed the knife, my last desperate act, and plunged it into his chest. For a moment, nothing happened. The man just stood there, his grin never faltering, his eyes locked onto mine. And then, slowly, his expression began to change. The grin faded, replaced by something else. Pain, fear, confusion. The darkness around us started to recede, the shadows pulling back, the figures in the void retreating. The man staggered back, the knife still lodged in his chest, his eyes wide with shock. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something human in his gaze. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he collapsed, crumpling to the floor in a heap, the shadows dissipating around him, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. I stood there, shaking, barely able to breathe, waiting for something to happen, for him to get back up, for the darkness to return. But it didn't. The apartment was still, the air clear. The man was gone. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, it was morning and the sun was streaming through the windows. The apartment was a mess. Broken glass, overturned furniture, bloodstains on the floor where I had cut myself on the glass. But the man was gone. Really gone. I moved out that day, didn't even bother packing my things. I just left, got in my car, and drove until I couldn't drive anymore. I've never gone back, never checked to see if the apartment is still there. I don't want to know. I just want to forget, to pretend that none of it ever happened. But I know better. I know that he's still out there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment to come back. Because even though I fought back, even though I drove him away, I didn't kill him. I couldn't kill him. Because you can't kill something that was never alive to begin with.